Hi everyone. Not only do I have the terrible task of following Andrew, but I was told that I was going to come on at 2:30, and so I had allocated lunchtime to actually prepare what I was going to say. So you're going to have to bear with me whilst I just reassemble my thoughts. I think what really struck me yesterday and what I really wanted to talk about was the place of UK community foundations. I've come into the community foundation sector relatively late into my career, and what I immediately realised was the power of community foundations. And what really impressed me and excited me was the fact that we have so much independence to set our own agenda. However, the UK community foundation sector also, as Andrew has pointed out, is deeply vested in maintaining the system. We have a sector where I will go to conferences like this, to events like this, and I will be the only person of colour in the room. And that's why, and even yesterday I actually went to a conference in London run by Nesta on the future of foundations. So it was sort of taking a horizon scan on foundations across the UK and what the future was looking like. And I think in a room this size, there were 3 people of colour in that room. So this is the context within which I operate. And I don't know if many of you can relate to that or not. And what that set me on a journey, what that did was set me on a journey in terms of looking at my individual power and how I can shift the system. So in terms of my individual power, although I used to be a lawyer, a recovering lawyer like Baljit, I'm not a person who feels comfortable in the limelight, which is why this is incredibly nerve-wracking. And I'm also not a person who speaks up very often. But within the foundation sector, I felt that I had a responsibility. I was in a position of power and privilege. I became CEO of a community foundation fairly early on, and I realised that that enabled me to actually make a lot of change. So in terms of my individual power, I completed a master's in grant making. I learned about philanthropy. I learned about what should be happening. And then I started to think about how I can shift the dial in terms of the system within the UK. Now, within the system of the UK, we still talk about equality. We don't talk about equity. If you meet foundations and you talk about equity, they won't know what you're referring to. They still think that people should be treated in the same way rather than fairly, which is a very important distinction. So what I began to think about was how can I use my power as a CEO to start shifting the dial in terms of the whole foundation sector. And that's quite an overwhelming task. If any of you have worked within the UK foundation sector, it's very traditional, it's very risk averse, it's very conservative, and we use terms like diversity. We don't talk about racism. In my sort of 4 years now in the UK foundation sector, the word racism, even talking about race itself or ethnicity, is very contested. It's not a conversation that we have. Using language like white supremacy, white privilege, those words will never appear in our meetings or our events. So in that context, what I thought about was how do I create a movement for change? What can I, as an individual, as a lone person, working in this whole system, what can I actually physically do? And I developed a proposal to actually bring coalitions to work together. I contacted 14 foundations in the UK, many of which you'll have heard of, National Lottery, Children in Need, Lloyds Bank Foundation, etc. And I said to them that in my own foundation, what I'm planning to do is to implement a diversity, equity and inclusion framework, being the first foundation in the UK to implement this. Now, what what I'm really focused on is racial inequality. That's my passion, that's what I studied, that's what I did my dissertation on. But I knew that if I talked to foundations in the UK about racial inequality, you know, people would listen very politely. We're very polite here in the UK, but there would not be a shift there would not be the shift that I wanted to see. So by stating or by framing a proposal along the lines of diversity, equity and inclusion framework, I've managed to get 15 foundations to say that they will also work with me over the next 3 years to implement those frameworks in their foundation. And we will have difficult conversations about racism, about colonialism. It would have been wonderful to have those explicit conversations right from the start, but I know that within the sector that appetite and engagement isn't there, which is why I've had to use the diversity, equity and inclusion framework. But what I'm really hoping is that will create a ripple effect. So these 14, 15 leading foundations will then, once they've implemented the framework, disseminate that learning, which will transform the whole sector. That's what my aim is, and that's why I was thinking about how to share with you what my personal journey is in terms of using my individual power to think how I can change the whole sector. It's going to be extremely challenging. I'm not under any illusions that it won't be, but as I often say to my children, if you don't challenge yourself, then you never know what you'll become. Thank you.